This is the story of a motorcycle engine so dominant, so utterly superior to everything else on the racetrack, that the governing body of international motorsport had no choice but to ban it. They didn't just beat it. They didn't just regulate it. They changed the rules of racing forever just to stop it. The machine in question was Honda's RC166, a 250 cubic centimeter six-cylinder masterpiece that won so consistently, so relentlessly, that officials decided the only fair solution was to outlaw every 5- and 6-cylinder engine from competition entirely. Along the way, we will encounter Japanese engineering genius, European racing dynasties humiliated on their home turf, a legendary rider who pushed the limits of what was humanly possible, and a controversy that still sparks debate among motorsport historians today. So, let us begin. But first, what was motorcycle racing like before Honda arrived to change everything? To understand why the RC166 mattered, you need to understand what Grand Prix motorcycle racing looked like in the early 1960s. This was the golden age of European dominance. Italian manufacturers like MV Agusta, Moto Guzzi, and Gilera had ruled the circuits for decades. The British had their Norton and AJS machines. The Germans contributed BMW and NSU. These were proud racing nations with deep traditions, legendary riders, and engineering philosophies refined over half a century of competition. The 250cc and 350cc classes were considered the purest tests of motorcycle engineering and rider skill. Not too big, not too small, fast enough to be dangerous, but requiring genuine finesse. The Europeans owned these categories. They assumed they always would. And then Honda showed up. I mention this because what happened next wasn't just a sporting upset. It was a cultural earthquake. Japan in the late 1950s was still rebuilding from the devastation of World War II. Japanese manufacturing was associated with cheap goods, low quality, imitation rather than innovation. The idea that a Japanese company could challenge, let alone defeat, the mighty European racing establishment seemed absurd. Soichiro Honda did not care what seemed absurd. Honda had founded his company in 1948, initially producing motorized bicycles. By 1954, he had declared his intention to compete in the Isle of Man TT, the most prestigious motorcycle race in the world. European racing insiders laughed. Here was this upstart Japanese manufacturer with no racing pedigree, no heritage, no history, announcing he would take on the best in the world on their own territory. They stopped laughing soon enough. Honda's approach to racing was fundamentally different from the Europeans. While Italian and British engineers relied heavily on tradition, experience, and incremental refinement, Honda threw resources at systematic research and development. They didn't just build race bikes. They built factories to build race bikes. They recruited the best engineering talent in Japan. They studied every competitor's machine with obsessive detail. And critically, they were willing to try things that conventional wisdom said were impossible. The multi-cylinder philosophy emerged from a simple observation. If you want more power from a small displacement engine, you need higher revolutions. If you want higher revolutions, you need smaller, lighter components. And if you want enough small, light components to produce serious horsepower, you need more cylinders. The mathematics were elegant. A 6-cylinder 250cc engine meant each cylinder displaced just over 41 cubic centimeters. Tiny cylinders meant tiny pistons. Tiny pistons meant minimal reciprocating mass. Minimal reciprocating mass meant you could spin the engine to astronomical speeds without it tearing itself apart. At least, that was the theory. Turning theory into a working race engine was another matter entirely. The engineering challenges were staggering. Imagine trying to build 6 perfectly balanced cylinders, each about the size of a shot glass, all working in harmony at 18,000 revolutions per minute. The tolerances involved were measured in microns. The precision required was closer to watchmaking than conventional motorcycle manufacturing. Honda's engineers spent years refining the concept. They experimented with 4-cylinder and 5-cylinder configurations before settling on the inline-6. Each iteration taught them something. Each failure revealed a weakness to be eliminated. The development process consumed vast resources, required solutions to problems no one had ever solved, and demanded a level of perfectionism that bordered on obsession. By 1964, Honda had a working 6-cylinder, 250cc prototype. It produced around 60 horsepower, which sounds modest until you realize the displacement. That's roughly 240 horsepower per liter, an absolutely extraordinary specific output for the era. The European competition was producing perhaps 40 to 45 horsepower from similar displacements. Honda had a 30 to 40% power advantage, but raw power meant nothing without a rider capable of exploiting it. Enter Mike Hailwood. If you don't know who Mike Hailwood was, he was arguably the greatest motorcycle racer of his generation, possibly of all time. The son of a wealthy motorcycle dealer, Hailwood had been racing since his teens and possessed a combination of natural talent, fearlessness, and technical sensitivity that made him almost supernaturally fast. By the early 60s, he was already a multiple world champion with MV Agusta. Honda wanted him. They needed a proven winner to showcase their revolutionary machine. Hailwood was intrigued by the technical challenge. In 1966, he joined Honda's factory racing team. This is where it gets fascinating. The RC166, as the race-ready 6-cylinder was designated, was unlike anything Hailwood had ever ridden. The engine screamed to over 18,000 RPM, producing a sound that witnesses described as unlike any motorcycle they had heard before or since. A high-pitched wail, almost mechanical screaming, that announced the Honda's presence before it even came into view. The power delivery was remarkably smooth for such a high-strung engine. All those cylinders firing in rapid succession meant the power pulses blended together, creating a turbine-like surge rather than the staccato punch of a single or twin-cylinder machine. Hailwood later said it felt like being connected to an electric motor. The handling, however, was challenging. 6 cylinders meant a wide engine. A wide engine meant compromised lean angle in corners. The Honda engineers had worked miracles to keep the package as narrow as possible, but physics imposed limits. Hailwood had to adapt his riding style, finding new lines through corners, learning when to use the extraordinary power and when the handling limitations demanded restraint. The 1966 season was a massacre. Hailwood won 10 of the 12 250cc Grand Prix races that year, 10 out of 12. The other 2 second-place finishes. He clinched the World Championship with races to spare. The European competition wasn't just beaten, they were humiliated. Machines that had been competitive the previous year were now hopelessly outclassed. Riders who had fought for victories found themselves racing for minor points positions, while Hailwood disappeared into the distance. If you're enjoying this story of engineering brilliance and sporting domination, consider subscribing. It helps us reach more people who love these kinds of deep dives into motorsport history. But anyway, back to the devastation Honda was inflicting on Grand Prix racing. The 350cc class told a similar story. Honda developed a larger version of the 6-cylinder concept, and Hailwood dominated there too. 2 world championships in the same season, 2 different displacement classes, the same outcome, Honda and Hailwood standing on top of the podium, everyone else fighting for scraps. The reaction from the European manufacturers ranged from denial to despair. MV Agusta, the previously dominant Italian manufacturer, poured resources into matching Honda's multi-cylinder approach. They couldn't do it, not in time. The engineering leap Honda had made represented years of development, and there was no shortcut to catching up. Some European engineers argued that Honda was essentially cheating. not violating the rules exactly, but exploiting them in ways that the rules were never intended to allow. The regulations specified maximum displacement. They said nothing about how many cylinders you could use to achieve that displacement. Honda had found a loophole and driven a 6-cylinder truck through it. Others argued that this was simply good engineering. The rules allowed any configuration. Honda built the best configuration. If the Europeans couldn't match it, that was their problem. Make no mistake, though. The dominance was becoming a problem for the sport itself. Motorcycle Grand Prix racing depended on competition for its appeal. Fans wanted to see battles, passes, drama, uncertainty about the outcome. What they were getting instead was Hailwood on the Honda, followed by a growing gap, followed eventually by everyone else. Television coverage became predictable. Attendance at some circuits dropped. Sponsors began questioning whether their money was being well spent when the results seemed predetermined. The FIM, the international governing body for motorcycle racing, faced a dilemma. They couldn't simply ban Honda for being too good. That would be transparently unfair and would set a terrible precedent. But they also couldn't allow the situation to continue indefinitely. Something had to change. As we will see, the solution they chose would reshape motorcycle racing for decades to come. The 1967 season continued the pattern. Hailwood and Honda won both the 250cc and 350cc World Championships again. The margins were smaller in some races as the competition improved, but the overall result was the same. 2 titles, 2 classes, total dominance. Behind the scenes, however, political discussions were intensifying. European manufacturers lobbied the FIM aggressively. They argued that the multi-cylinder approach was unsustainable for smaller manufacturers. Only a company with Honda's resources could afford to develop and maintain such complex machinery. The racing grid was shrinking as privateer teams, unable to afford competitive equipment, withdrew from competition. If the trend continued, Grand Prix racing would become a contest between factory Honda teams and no one else. There was some merit to this argument. Building and maintaining a 6-cylinder race engine required specialized knowledge, precision equipment, and substantial budgets. A gentleman racer with a well-prepared twin-cylinder machine had always had some chance against factory entries. Against the RC166, they had no chance at all. The democratizing element of motorcycle racing was being destroyed. The counterargument was equally valid. Motor racing had always evolved. Progress meant some technologies became obsolete. If the Europeans wanted to compete, they should develop better machines rather than lobbying to ban machines that beat them. Changing the rules to handicap the fastest competitor was fundamentally anti-competitive. I mention this because the debate continues in motorsport today. Every time a team or manufacturer becomes too dominant, the same arguments resurface. Do you change the rules to create artificial competition, or do you let excellence be rewarded even if it means predictable results? At any rate, the FIM made their decision. For the 1970 season, new regulations would take effect. All 2-stroke engines would be limited to 2 cylinders. All 4-stroke engines would be limited to 4 cylinders. Maximum displacement for each class remained unchanged, but the exotic 5- and 6-cylinder configurations that Honda had pioneered would be banned. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Honda's entire racing strategy had been built around multi-cylinder supremacy. Their 4-cylinder machines were competitive but not dominant. Their 2-cylinder machines were adequate but unremarkable. The specific advantages that the RC166 provided, its extraordinary specific power output, its smooth power delivery, its ability to out-accelerate anything on the grid, all vanished under the new regulations. Honda withdrew from Grand Prix racing at the end of the 1967 season. Officially, the withdrawal was unrelated to the rule changes. The company cited a desire to focus on production motorcycles and new markets. Unofficially, everyone understood what had happened. The FIM had changed the rules specifically to stop Honda's dominance, and Honda responded by taking their toys and going home. Here's the thing about the Honda withdrawal. It wasn't just about the RC166, it was about respect. Or rather, the lack of it. Honda's engineers felt they had achieved something extraordinary. They had out-engineered the best racing manufacturers in the world. They had won fair and square within the existing rules. And their reward was having those rules changed to prevent them from winning again. Soichiro Honda took it personally. He had bet his company's reputation on racing success. He had invested millions in developing machinery that was now effectively worthless. And the European establishment had essentially declared that Japanese engineering excellence was unwelcome at their party. The bitterness would last for years. Honda did not return to Grand Prix motorcycle racing until 1979, more than a decade later. When they did return, the regulations had evolved further, and the six-cylinder approach was a distant memory. But the competitive fire that Soichiro Honda had instilled in his company remained. They would win again, many times, but never with anything quite like the RC166. Now, this is where it gets really interesting from a historical perspective. The RC166 ban had consequences that extended far beyond Honda. It fundamentally shaped the direction of motorcycle racing technology for the next several decades. Without the possibility of multi-cylinder exotic engines, development focused on other areas. Two-stroke engines, which the regulations still permitted with up to 2 cylinders, became the dominant technology. Engineers found they could extract extraordinary power from relatively simple twin-cylinder two-strokes, and the complexity of 4-stroke multi-cylinder engines became unnecessary. The two-stroke era would last until environmental concerns and noise regulations eventually killed it in the early 2000s. When 4-strokes returned to prominence, it was in the form of the MotoGP class with its own cylinder limits. The specific configuration of the RC166 inline 6-cylinder 4-stroke has never been competitive in top-level motorcycle racing since, not because it couldn't work. We know it worked extraordinarily well, but because the regulations have never again permitted it. Some historians argue that the RC166 ban was the right decision. It preserved competitive racing, protected smaller manufacturers, and prevented the sport from becoming a contest of financial resources rather than engineering skill and rider talent. The diversity of the Grand Prix grid in subsequent decades, they suggest, validates the FIM's choice. Others argue it was a betrayal of the sport's fundamental values. Racing should reward excellence. Honda was excellent. Punishing them for being too good was anti-competitive and set a terrible precedent. The constant rule changes that have plagued motorsport ever since, they suggest, all stem from this original sin of changing regulations to handicap the fastest competitor. We can only imagine how motorcycle racing might have evolved differently if the 6-cylinder engines had been allowed to continue. Perhaps Honda would have faced genuine competition as other manufacturers developed their own multi-cylinder machines. Perhaps the technology would have filtered down to production motorcycles decades earlier than it actually did. Perhaps the entire trajectory of motorcycle engineering would have been different. But that's not what happened. What happened was a ban. And the RC166 became a legend, not just for what it achieved, but for what it was prevented from achieving. And what of the key figures in this story? Mike Hailwood continued racing after Honda's withdrawal, though never again with machinery quite as dominant. He switched to car racing in the 70s, competing in Formula One and sport cars with moderate success. In 1978, at the age of 38, he returned to motorcycle racing for the Isle of Man TT, winning the Formula One class in one of the most remarkable comeback performances in sporting history. Tragically, Hailwood died in 1981 in a car accident near his home in England. He was collecting fish and chips with his 2 children when another vehicle collided with his car. His daughter also died in the crash. A heartbreaking end for one of the greatest racers ever to live. Soichiro Honda stepped back from day-to-day involvement in his company during the 1970s, though he remained a spiritual leader and public figure until his death in 1991. He never fully forgave the European racing establishment for the RC166 ban, but he channeled his competitive energy into other areas. Honda grew into one of the largest motorcycle and automobile manufacturers in the world, and Soichiro's philosophy of racing excellence continued to drive the company long after his retirement. He is remembered as one of the great industrialists of the 20th century, a self-made man who challenged established powers and won. The RC166 itself survived. Several original machines remain in Honda's collection, maintained in running condition. Occasionally they are demonstrated at vintage racing events, their distinctive 6-cylinder scream reminding audiences of what once was. For collectors and enthusiasts, the RC166 represents perhaps the ultimate motorcycle racing artifact, a machine so perfect for its purpose that the only way to beat it was to declare it illegal. There's something poignant about that if you think about it. The RC166 wasn't banned because it broke the rules. It was banned because it was too good at following them. Honda's engineers found an approach that the regulations permitted, executed it with extraordinary skill, and won decisively. The response was not admiration, but prohibition. Motor racing has always had a complicated relationship with excellence. We celebrate the champions, build statues of the winners, tell stories of their triumphs. But when anyone wins too much, too consistently, too dominantly, we start to get uncomfortable. We want competition, we want uncertainty, we want drama. And if the best competitor is so much better than everyone else that the drama disappears, we change the rules until the drama returns. The RC166 was a victim of its own success. Had it been merely excellent, merely competitive, merely impressive, it might have raced for years longer. But it was more than excellent, it was dominant, and dominance in the end was its downfall. Consider what this meant for the engineers who created it. They spent years of their lives solving problems no one had solved before. They achieved something genuinely remarkable, pushed the boundaries of what a motorcycle engine could do, created a machine that will be studied and admired for as long as people care about motorsport. And their reward was being told that their creation was too good and would have to be retired. That's a strange kind of victory. The best kind, perhaps, but also the most bittersweet. The legacy of the RC166 extends beyond the record books and the controversies. It established Honda as a serious player in international motorsport, not just a manufacturer of transportation but a creator of racing machinery that could compete with and defeat the world's best. Every Honda racing success since, from their later Grand Prix championships to their Formula One victories, traces back in some way to the audacity of the RC166 project. It also changed how we think about motorcycle engineering. Before the RC166, the conventional wisdom was that more cylinders meant more complexity, more weight, more potential problems. Honda proved that with sufficient engineering skill, more cylinders meant more power, smoother delivery, and overwhelming competitive advantage. The specific approach may have been banned, but the underlying philosophy that systematic engineering could overcome traditional limitations became Honda's calling card. And it raised questions about sporting regulation that we still haven't fully answered. When someone wins too much, what should we do about it? The FIM chose intervention, changing the rules to create artificial parity. Other sports have made similar choices in the years since. Whether those choices are wise or foolish, fair or unjust, remains a matter of debate. Well, there we are. The story of the Honda RC166, a 6-cylinder masterpiece that dominated racing so thoroughly that the authorities banned every 5- and 6-cylinder engine from competition. A machine that won not by breaking rules, but by exploiting them more cleverly than anyone else. A triumph of Japanese engineering over European tradition, and ultimately a cautionary tale about what happens when excellence becomes too excellent for its own good. The RC-166 proved that sometimes the greatest compliment your competitors can pay you is to change the rules so they don't have to face you anymore. Honda built a motorcycle so fast, so dominant, so utterly superior that the only way to beat it was to make it illegal. That is not nothing. In fact, that might be the purest kind of victory there is. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.